Welcome everybody to session number 2 here at our Healthy Communities from the Ground Up conference. We're so happy you've joined us. Without further ado, I will start our soil health and outreach panel. Little background on this: the Kansas Rural Center last year received a grant from an organization we're a part of called the National Healthy Soil Policy Network. And this organization works to promote legislation and advocacy in state houses across the nation to increase conservation work, promote soil health policy, and those types of things. And so KRC did a soil health survey last year where we surveyed farmers and asked them about their attitudes on different soil health practices like cover cropping, doing things like reducing herbicide, pesticide use, and fertilizers, and also their attitudes towards government programs and policies that they use or stay away from, and why they do those things. And we also had a couple panel discussions with farmers that we had up on our website that are recordings of, and I'll link that in the chat here in a little bit. But that brings us to our current panel, which we've assembled of a number of folks working on soil health here in Kansas. And I will let them introduce themselves a little bit, but let's go with Steve. You're first on my screen.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Swapper. I'm the Executive Director with No-Till in the Plains. I've been in this role 7.5 years, and have been working in agriculture for the last 23 years. Grew up on a farm in north central Oklahoma, working with my grandparents. A little bit about No-Till in the Plains. It's a 26-year-old organization that is directed by a group of volunteer producers. We have been promoting some aspect, one of the principles of soil health since the very beginning, thus the name No-Till on the Plains. And so in the last 26 years, the organization has evolved to embrace a much broader set of principles and practices than just no-till. And so we are now really focused on soil health and regenerative agriculture and all of those buzzwords that you see in the current ag magazines and media outlets. And so I look forward to interacting with the other panelists, and hope you all have a great day, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Steve. And I should have posed the question to you a little bit more, but let's go to Katie. Say a little bit about your background, connection to agriculture, and how you interact with soil health.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Burke. I'm an assistant professor in agricultural and environmental communications at Kansas State University. Anything I say about soil health today on the panel are my own opinions. I previously worked for the Division of Conservation with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, so that's how I'm familiar with government cost share. I spent my summers in Pennsylvania on my grandparents' farm. So that's my biggest connection to agriculture. But I've lived in Kansas for 16 years, and I fell in love with the prairie and the ecological systems of the prairie. I have formal training in surface water processes, runoff, infiltration, flooding, stream bank erosion. So that's my lens looking at soil health. That's my main interest in soil health, but I know it's much, much bigger than that. So I currently am also working on a social science project related to perceptions of soil health in the state, barriers to adoption of practices, how people want to get information about soil health. And so Ryan and I have been talking about the similarities and differences of our study and how that can help efforts around soil health in the state. Happy to be on the panel with the rest of these wonderful folks, and I look forward to your questions.
Katie. Jessica, would you go next?
Hi, thank you, Ryan. Well, first, let me say that it's an honor to be on this panel alongside my colleagues. This is just absolutely fantastic. And like Katie, I come from the social science of things. I'm a graduate of Kansas State University with a degree in social science of diversity. And for the last number of years, really had an inspiration from attending my first Kansas Rural Center meeting about 10 years ago, and had this transition of thought process of, wow, I'm looking at my community through the lens of healthy food and gaining access, not only for my family, but for others. So it was really through the influence of Kansas Rural Center and these healthy food initiatives that I became interested in soil health. My husband and I farm 150 acres in the Pratt County area, but we have since transplanted ourselves to Manhattan, Kansas, where I work as the executive director of Great Plains Regeneration. So we are a new nonprofit that are working to be a liaison between large and small stakeholders in the farming community to promote soil health. The ways that we seek to do that are through farmer-led education, research, and outreach, watershed restoration with our partners, Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams. And then we have a heavy focus right now on new market development. We're looking for things that are unique that we can bring to the not only the nonprofit space, but also to the business development space of our organization. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jessica. Jennifer, why don't you round it out?
Thank you as well for inviting me to be part of the panel today. I'm excited to be here and be part of this conversation. I am Jennifer Simelink, and I'm the coordinator of the Kansas Soil Health Alliance. We are very new. We formed just last year, became a 501c3 in February. So pretty new in the space, but very excited to be here. Our goal, we have a board made up of all farmers and ranchers. And our goal is to improve and protect Kansas soils through farmer-to-farmer education. For the most part, at the heart of it, that's what we're here to do. So a little background on myself. I grew up in York, Nebraska, which is a pretty rural community, but my family did not grow up farming. I worked in the seed corn fields in the summer. That's what everyone there would do. So that was my first introduction. My primary introduction to soil health, though, came through my classes. I also attended Kansas State. I was in biological and agricultural engineering and had a secondary major in natural resources and environmental sciences. So I had a lot of classes that talked about natural resources, how to preserve that air and water and keep them healthy. So that just really kind of triggered things with me. Shortly after college, my biggest connection to soil health became when I married into farming. So I currently live on a farm and ranch in rural Jewell County up here in north central Kansas. We have 3 children, and I've spent a majority of the last 16 years now at home with them. So soil health has paid our bills. It has been our primary source of income and how we are continuing to farm and ranch. It's a part of our retirement plan. It is there. So when we talk about wanting to care for it, it's a mixture of doing the right thing and doing the best we can, as well as keeping our family on the land and keeping it healthy for future generation, whether it's one of our children or someone else who gets to care for it after us. So, for me, I just love to be around nature, seeing how the ecosystems work. I want that clean water and clean air. And then as being part of the Alliance now on the professional side, I get the opportunity to work with my great board of farmers and ranchers, our partners, and then take that message out and help others in the state to do the same thing.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll continue kind of in this order: Steve, Katie, Jessica, Jennifer. Steve, you mentioned that soil health is a hot topic or buzzwords right now. Would you be willing to share a little bit about how you personally or No Till on the Plains kind of define soil health, or maybe some of the main tenets of what you're trying to reach when you talk about soil health with producers and the public?
Sure. So soil health is somewhat of a undefined term from a professional standpoint. But I define and our board defines soil health as a highly functional ecological system that includes all of the levels of biology within the soil. Most people think of soil as a dry environment, when in actuality, a fully functioning, healthy ecosystem that is the soil is quite aqueous in a lot of ways, that without water, many of those organisms do not survive. So at different trophic levels, at different predator-prey levels, the soil is just the same as any ecosystem above ground, any terrestrial ecosystem. It's just we don't see them as easily. And so a healthy soil is going to be able to contribute to a healthy, profitable crop or a healthy, profitable animal. And I think those are the two main tenets that we work with producers, is to say, if your soil is doing its job, your plants will be healthy and your animals will be healthy, and you'll have less expense to try and keep them that way. But really, it's about the functionality of an ecosystem.
Thank you. Katie, since your work is in a little bit of a different area, I imagine that you need to work within some of the definitions of soil health as provided by, say, the Kansas Department of Agriculture or USDA. Do you share a little bit, if you want to, about how you define soil health, or how it is kind of defined for you within the context of agricultural communications?
Sure. I'll just share my individual view of soil health and how I think about soil health, and it's very similar to what Steve said. It's the physical properties, it's the chemical properties, and the biological properties that make a functioning, I like how Steve said, a highly functioning ecosystem. So soil health doesn't only apply to agricultural land. It's any land that has a high functioning soil community, which then ideally in turn produces better plants, the plants that we want. So it also, from my lens, my training in surface water processes, more infiltration, less runoff, cleaner water, less flashy floods. So that's also how soil health absolutely has to do with regenerative ag and certain practices, but it also depends on where you're located in the region, in the country, what your weather is like. Yeah, similar thoughts to Steve, really.
Thank you. Jessica, you have regeneration in the name of your organization. Can you talk a little bit about how soil health is defined in your work?
Yeah, thank you. And, with great gratitude, I will echo some of the sentiments of Katie and Steve. They both mentioned the functionality of an ecosystem. And I think that what Great Plains Regeneration seeks to do is add in that human layer to the conversation of soil health and the way that we work together. And so one of our board advisors is Ray Archuleta, and he has a definition that we refer to. And so it does add a different layer. So regenerative agriculture is a renewal of the heart and the mind that transforms ranching and farming. A conscientious agriculture which mimics nature's patterns and its architecture. A collaborative relationship between nature and humans that will enhance all biological biodiversity, restore human health, and improve socioeconomic resilience for rural America. So this is not to replace any of the other definitions. This is to enhance them. And that's kind of the focus of what we're doing with Great Plains Regeneration.
Jennifer?
Sure. For the Alliance, we're using, as far as the heart of the definition, we're using the NRCS's definition, where we're talking about soil health is the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So taking that, and Jessica and Steve brought it, to that broader and providing a little more context to that definition. But all of those encapsulated in it. But then, particularly within the Alliance, we're taking it the step further we're taking it is to give it that real practical definition, the boots on the ground definition. So we're saying with soil health, you know, a healthy soil helps our farmers and ranchers to achieve profitability in an ecologically sound manner, and, you know, to regenerate and restore productivity for future generations. You know, all the benefits you get from soil health, you know, if you're talking about the storing carbon, you know, that biodiversity, the increased infiltration, you're reducing erosion, you know, all of those are components that go towards helping with, you know, ultimately that profitability. You know, that's a big source for us, you know, keep those who are on the ground here and doing what they can do.
Thank you. So back to Steve. Kind of in your work, or I'll preface this question with a little bit of information about our survey at KRC. Our survey results came back that use of cover crops is really the biggest use of a soil health practice as kind of commonly defined, and managed grazing and no-till are some other big ones. And a lot of people wanted to expand cover crop usage and incorporate new grazing practices in the future as they can. I'm curious for all of you, do you see other practices being utilized quite a bit successfully? Are there things that people are really avoiding? We'll start there. Steve?
Yeah, I think you hit the big three that people have been able to adopt easily. Minimizing tillage, adding some cover crops, but I think the one that is most avoided and maybe most important, or 1B, so to speak, is keeping a living root 365 days a year, because that is the most challenging practice to relate to a principle. Timing of our harvests makes it challenging to get in right behind a late corn or soybean harvest. Moisture is always an issue for those producers that are in the western half of the state of Kansas. But the producers that we work with that have adopted that practice can see the benefits multiply by having that living root 365 days a year. The pieces of information I think that producers are missing the most in implementing that principle is, what species do I choose for what time of year for the amount of available water that I have? And that answer is different for every producer. It's different on every farm. And it may be as small a distance as 1 mile from one farm to another, and that answer changes. Soil type, whether you have salinity in your soils, may dictate what choice you make in cover crops, or that forage that you put out there to overwinter livestock. But to me, that is the principle that we see implemented the least, and probably the most challenging for producers, and the one that we as a community need to provide the most assistance and information about.
Yeah, definitely not a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. And I'll just echo what my father says, that he admires Gabe Brown in North Dakota a lot, but Gabe Brown's situation is vastly different than what we deal with here. And so that, I mean, even just a mile, or hundreds of miles, what we're doing. But Katie, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. I don't interact directly with producers very often, but preliminary results from the survey that we just conducted show very similar things. People are all across the board in terms of what new soil health practice they might implement, or what they're interested in related to soil health. But a common trend is all related to cover crops, either starting cover crops or managing livestock on covers, or some other management of cover crops. it's not the only thing, but it's a common trend. And I don't have any information about, from my perspective, what hurdles there are, what producers might avoid, but there are a lot of different interests in a lot of different areas related to soil health. But again, I'll echo that cover crop trend.
Thank you. I'll just say from our KRC survey, some of the big barriers to implementing more stuff, a lot of it's cost and time, which is common sense, I think, as well. But asking folks who are already very busy to do something new is a tough barrier to overcome sometimes. So
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Kate.
No, sorry. I was just going to echo, cost. And that's actually something I'm very interested in is barriers, because I know that cost is always talked about, not only the financial cost, but the time. But there are some other barriers that we're seeing in our survey too. Like, I want to learn more about it, just the knowledge barrier, or I want proof that it's going to work for me before I really invest. So that's something I'm really interested in, to see what additional barriers there are in addition to cost. Yeah.
That's a great point, and I'll just say that's something our survey didn't take into account. I gave some made answers like cost or time. I didn't include risk. That feeling that you're risking that money or your time, obviously, and sacrificing that. So that's a good point. Jessica?
Yeah, cover crops. It's the gateway all the way to all of these soil health regenerative ag stuff. But thinking about barriers to adoption, first off, there's a really great report that has been published recently. It was backed by Patagonia, and it talked about barriers to the adoption of regenerative agriculture. And one that was highlighted in that research states that lack of trusted advisors was probably, encapsulating all the things that Katie and Steve talked about as far as understanding your species, your timing, what sort of agronomic input that you can gain as being one of the biggest barriers to adoption. And so the way that Great Plains Regeneration thinks about this and the way that we communicate our barriers is that if you consider what we're talking about here with regenerative agriculture through the lens of the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture, within each one of those principles, there are various practices to which a producer can achieve a principle, right? And another thing that we stress is that these practices are place-based. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are gaining agronomic advisement in different regions, not only across the Great Plains, whether that be in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, but that the agronomic advice that is for that particular area is relevant. What we don't want to see is thinking back to our prescriptive farming methods, Northeast Kansas, as all of you know, is vastly different than Southwest Kansas. And so the ways in which we aim for the principles of regenerative agriculture, the practices in each areas might be a little bit different. So I definitely agree with cover crops. I agree with, the lack of trusted advisement, whether that be your agronomist, your co-op, your peers, whatever the case might be. That's something that we have a genuine focus on. But also, case studies, getting these case studies out, making sure that they're relevant, and making sure that producers can glean knowledge from folks who have come before them, and to be able to make some adoption. So that report, I can stick it in the chat. It's a really great report if anybody wants to read it.
Yeah, please do. Thank you. Jennifer, early on in the formation of the Kansas Soil Health Alliance, I was either talking to you or Michael, and it was posed to me that the organization is kind of set up as a clearinghouse for soil health information in the state. How, in terms of what some of those have said about trust in advisement, things like that, or this question that's been going to the others, what thoughts do you have?
Sure. And definitely that is what we were put in place for. So I was handed, when I took over this position, a very wonderful board At this point, we have 7 board members, and they come from across the state. So we have that representation, as Jessica said, what's happening in, the different corners of the state are vastly different from each other. So we have representation there. And my board, they're all the ones out there doing stuff and trying stuff. So when you talk about what's being used on operations, they're doing the whole gamut, whatever can be done. So we have them to use as those resources. But in addition to just my board providing input to me, our website is designed, to provide resources to growers across the state, no matter, we're working on no matter what size their farm and no matter where they're at with adopting the principles, the practices, whether they're just starting to get into it or they're further down the line. So one of our key efforts is developing a calendar of all events, like this today, that are related to soil health in Kansas, so that growers across the state can go look at that, find what's going on to plan their education. I think we've all said, farmer to farmer education is really the most trusted source and the best way to spread the word. So, within the Alliance, we're saying that doesn't have to come from us. We're just putting up where things are so everyone can find, we're happy to provide education. We had our first event this last week. We'll be doing more, but there's so many providing great things. And another thing we're continuing to work on is resources, Kansas specific resources. When we're talking about, when you're talking about those barriers to adoption, risk is huge. I mean, it's huge when you're looking at, the margins that you got, especially when we're talking on the larger scale, the traditional commodity crop farmers in Kansas. The margins aren't great. Prices right now are currently high. So for your grains, hard to take stuff out and take a risk. But many are finding, taking a portion, I think that was in the chat, just a small field, we have a little bit of ground we own. If we experiment on our farm, it's on our ground, or on, a real trusted landlord that we, have that conversation with what we're doing and see how it goes in the hopes of expanding. But that fear, that risk is a big barrier, as well as, I asked my husband a little bit about this, and he mentioned peer pressure, which I didn't expect, but it is also hard to be the first one out there doing things. You talk to some and they choose where they experiment, and it might not be on the main road, and it might be a back corner of a field. Farming's pretty unique. Everyone knows what equipment you're running. They can go by and look at your crops, and your failures are just as on display, more so than your success, because many are fairly humble and aren't about to go and boast on either side. So somewhat some private. So that was a component I wouldn't have thought of without checking with him. So yeah, our big is spreading word on these events, developing, as producers are there, growers are at these events, forming their connections themselves, forming, individual peer groups where you can have something. My husband's part of one. They have phone calls every other week. They can discuss what's going on their farms, struggles, triumphs. They can have that space, and they'll take field trips to each other's farms and do that one-on-one, farmer to farmer. Forming those connections is really what we're hoping to do. Stuff that's not easily measured, but hopefully the end product gets there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear about the group your husband's in. In the agriculture community I grew up in and the ones I work in now, that peer pressure, also one that I left off of our survey. That is, it's tough to try new things, and it's always off that main road, like you said. All of you, I think, kind of answered some of the next question, but I'm curious. So I think you've all been involved with agriculture for long enough, maybe not your current roles, to answer this question, but when you think about the soil health practices, outreach tools, I guess, farmer to farmer has always been, field tours has always been kind of a big one, but are there other outreach or training tools that you see have changed over the last, 5, 10, 15 years current, or maybe just even the broader conversation in the agricultural community around these issues. I always feel like looking at the farming magazines we get, talking about soil health and cover crops 15 years to today, very different in what is being popularized and what's being shared. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about how things have changed? Steve?
Yeah, it has clearly infiltrated mainstream publications and media. But when you go look across the landscape and you try to assess how much soil health is out there, how much of each individual practice is being implemented on our landscape, 15 years ago to today, it's about the same. And there's a lot of factors that are affecting that, but landlords is a huge area that we have to address. Bankers, another one. These are folks that are in the producer circle that dictate some of the decisions that those producers have to make. And if they don't understand what a soil health principle is, or they don't understand why there's still stubble left out on their field, they're going to find a tenant who will do it the way that they want. And I believe that that's kind of our next step, so to speak, in the education and outreach process, is to try and reach those folks that are on the outside of the inner circle of producer management and decision making. I will also say that some of the technological advances that we've seen in our equipment and the way we handle information, I think has created some division between some of our producers, because it's all about my data, and how do I keep my data private from the bigger companies of the world, and I won't point any out specifically, but I think that carries over. And what Jennifer's husband and others that we work with have come to understand is that sharing their information is way more valuable than keeping it to themselves. And if we can continue to foster that cooperative sense within not just regenerative soil health agriculture, but beyond, so that those folks who are skeptical, that are suspicious of others, can see, hey, this works, and I'm willing to share with you how I make this work. I think we'll see a greater adoption coming from producers. But again, how much of our land is actually owned by the producer versus a landlord, and that's a big challenge right now in finding and reaching those folks.
Yeah, wonderful. Outreach to those folks in the kind of outer circle. It's an excellent point. Thank you, Steve. Katie, in a ag communications journalism sort of way, or in your personal observation, how do you feel like things have shifted over the last while? Or
yeah, I really appreciate, Steve, what you said about landlord situations. That came up a lot when I was working in cost share at the state level. And I know it happens at the federal level too with cost share programs, but also just purely management decisions, conversations and communication barriers between the renters and the landowners, or the managers and the landowners. Yeah, it keeps coming up as a topic. But in terms of outreach, I don't know exactly how the majority or percentages of landowners and producers get information, and that's part of the information I'm interested in studying more and more. But all I can say is it's more challenging now to do outreach, but also at the same time, there are some easier ways to do outreach. Like you can connect with people really quickly, but because so many people get information in so many different ways, you can't send an email and expect that everybody's going to see it and everybody's going to read it. And, so there's no one size fits all in the type of outreach that you do. are the channels that you use, because information and communication technology has changed so much and has broadened so much. And print is still alive. Like, we have people responding to our survey who absolutely use YouTube and Facebook, and we still have landowners and producers who want to read magazines. So the challenge in outreach, in my opinion, is figuring out how to get information out efficiently to the most people. So it's also it's a challenge, but it's also, yeah, you can get information to people quickly. Certain people quickly, the people who are using quick digital media. So
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have observed kind of a lot of tech startups to address agriculture. People are excited to get into agriculture, and they say this smartphone app is going to change your farming. And I don't know if that's really realistic at all, but a lot of the communication still seems to be at the coffee shop or at church, or even just on the side of the road. I see folks talking, and that's still a big one, I think. Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah. So when you mentioned tech companies with apps, there was a collective chuckle between me, Steve, and Jennifer all at the same time. And not to speak for them, but I bet that I field inquiries, I'd say maybe weekly, over a new app. There must have been some sort of feasibility that was put out that said tech companies need to produce apps for farmers, right? I'm not positive that that's what's needed. And a lot of times when, if I do take a discovery call with these groups, my first question are, do you have farmers and ranchers on your advisory panel that are helping you determine what sort of features that producers need? And when they tell me no, I offer to connect them with folks who I think might be good to advise them on their products. And so just to kind of step back from this conversation, 10 years ago, if we were talking about soil health in the farming community and you're at the coffee shop, first thing you do is you'd kind of look over your shoulder, to see who was listening to you. And you'd say, okay, hey, I heard about this guy in the county, and he's decreased his inputs, or he's not tilling, his field is a mess, right? And so for me, my natural curiosity was like, oh, let's figure out who this person is and figure out what they're doing, and let's learn about it. And so there's been a huge shift over the last couple of years. We see this with the conferences that go on here in Kansas that have sponsorships from CPG companies, from food and health organizations that are interested into it. So yeah, we're lighting the fire right now, but we absolutely need to understand that change takes time. And as we identify these barriers, we have to understand that I've never met a farmer or a rancher that doesn't want to take advantage of something innovative or do something to increase profitability and increase soil health and increase their contribution back to their community. But because there are so many identified barriers, things don't necessarily happen the way that our external consumer base or people in tech, they don't understand right yet. So I'm hoping that through having this new awareness of soil health, that we can bring the farmers and ranchers to the table with these companies and be able to help them do what they're best at. And I'll just say a couple things that GPR is doing that's innovative. I host a weekly farmer webinar, and it's a casual conversation. We really started doing these at the beginning of COVID, and they were happy hours. And then we realized we needed to bump the time up to noon to get more participation. So we do that. And then my digital media marketing experience tells me that because of COVID, in-person events are going to be stressful for at least another year or maybe even longer. So we do have to figure out what is that 2.0 outreach that millennials and Gen Z desire. And same thing when I mentioned tech companies not having farmers and ranchers on the board, we need to make sure that our orgs have the Gen Zs and have the millennials. Those are mysterious brains for me. Let's figure out how to make sure that we are appealing to their ways of receiving education. And I don't have a great answer for that, so still working on it.
Yeah, as a millennial, I don't either. But no, I think the point about keeping farmers and ranchers as the people driving stuff and informing what you do is a really great point too. So important to remember. Jennifer, do you have any?
Yeah. As far as outreach, we're technology age. We're all meeting right now. We could have done this, a handful of years ago in this way. So there's so much access to information, and I'm going to go back to kind of what Steve said on that too. That access is there for your landlords as well as for your growers, and it's a matter of what message are the landlords receiving, what message are producers receive or consumers receiving, and then the message that the growers can then take forward. The pressure is out there. If you think about your landlords, if they're doing a Google search, and I'm talking about a landlord that's further away from the farm, so those that maybe never worked, that were on the ground themselves, it just came to them. When they're looking things up, there's big names out there, and we appreciate them spreading the message, but sometimes the big names are a long ways down the road and make it look very easy. And the landlord has expectations that the growers can't meet. So that puts a little extra pressure on the grower, while they're out, doing what they're trying to do and then fielding those questions as well. So to be proactive on that conversation with the landlords and have those tools of here's what we can do and here's why, would be great. Then, when you're on the grower side of it, there's fantastic, ag forums and Facebook groups and all these things, talking about all this information. I'll say for myself, I've been in this space for a while, but I'm not the key decision maker on our farm. I know enough, but if you ask me the specific blends of the cover crop mixes we put in or the gains that we're getting on our cattle by doing the rotational grazing in our pastures or what we're doing, I can't give you those numbers. So I kind of consider myself a bit of a beginner in some of the ways. And when I'm in some of these forums or these groups, there's so much information coming at me, you get that paralysis of I don't know where to go. And that's where, technology has had great things. I mean, we've been able to use Google Pro to map out those fences in large pastures, but and to connect with people you wouldn't connect with otherwise. But we have to make sure, it doesn't hinder that one-on-one conversation, because that's where more of the growth is going to come. That one-on-one, whether it's with your landlord, whether it's with other growers, see those as key. They need to be there as well.
Thank you. I'm going to pull on a thread out of what you just said that's not on our approved question list, so get ready. So you mentioned consumers, which we've talked about, producers and the people who support them and organizations like yourselves, but for consumers, how do you see them having, some substantial role in this conversation? And if so, maybe how? And I'm not going to go one by one through you. You can just answer it if you want to, but sometimes I think producers feel pressure from consumers or the broader consumer side that maybe isn't fair, or that the people here have expectations, kind of like the landlord to producer situation, expectations that can't be met. They don't necessarily understand the reality on the ground, what it's like to actually produce animals or grain crops, etc. So any thoughts on the consumer's role in this conversation?
Ryan, I'll take a shot. And this is a little bit off of the beaten path, I think, of what most people think about how consumers can have an impact. I think we all see some changes in our fresh food availability coming from systems that are embracing soil health. When we go to farmers markets, when we go to some of these specialty grocery stores and that kind of thing. But what we don't see is in our standard grocery stores and places where most consumers buy their food is in that manufactured foods or our boxed goods or canned goods, the things that are not fresh, all those people that buy that product potentially can also be shareholders. And that's how you get food manufacturing to make some changes, is through their shareholders. We've all seen these big meetings where the CEO stands up in front of all of his shareholders and makes the annual report. And if somebody in a pair of blue jeans and a dirty t-shirt is a shareholder, they've got just as much right as the guy sitting right next to him with a $2,000 Armani suit. And to me, that is a natural place where some of these changes can be initiated. Those companies don't want that because that makes them work harder. It makes them source their ingredients differently. But I truly believe that if we're going to have a broad changeover in the food that's available and it's going to be coming from consumers, that may be the most effective way to get that change, because it's about the money.
Thanks, Steve. Jennifer, did you?
I was going to say, there's a positive thing to this becoming an issue that's not just in the ag community, and for all those who are interested in their food and what they're getting, they can put some heat. It's okay to give, put a little heat on our producers to make the change. It's not easy. Anyone who's, growing, or many, are generations in to it. And it's not easy to make a directional change. It is a challenge, but that heat can be there. It just needs to be the delivery of it. Too many times I think we're pitting people against each other, or the information that's there. It's just kind of ugly and unpleasant and doesn't bring the conversations there. But a good conversation, if I'm not saying every consumer is going to go visit a farm, but putting out the education piece that's there would be great. And then as Steve said, with the food companies, pay the farmers the premium for their regenerative product. Give it to them for their wheat or their soybeans or whatever that's grown in a regenerative manner, and that'll help with some conversations. I can't tell you how to fix that, but that would be fine. But consumers can be there, and the companies too, just in a way that wants to support and learn from those that are growing, and not in a accusing manner.
I have an additional comment off of that, Jennifer and Steve. So my world is agricultural and environmental communications. Like, we train college students to go tell the story of agriculture, basically, and to help bridge that gap between producer and consumer. So consumer perceptions are really important, and they really need to be part of the conversation. Just look at GM foods, organic foods, foods raised in a humane manner. People's purchasing decisions can influence what happens on the farm. So the messaging to them is really important, like you've all said, helping them understand what happens at the farm level, but also kind of getting over some misconceptions that they have. So training folks to be able to communicate with consumers about factual information, which is another hurdle, trying to battle all the information that is thrown at consumers, and the difficulties they have in figuring out what's factual and where to go for information is all really important.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. It's place-based communication as well. And I know that Steve, No Till in the Plains, and the Soil Health Alliance, they have producers in all regions of Kansas, and the way that they are prepped, and they've got speakers that are ready. They've got speakers that can talk about these topics to the regions that they're in. And I think it's really important that consumers also understand that there's no blanket of information. Like, we're not going to stop chemicals, or we're not going to stop, all of these other things that I think sometimes get perpetuated in the consumer speak that isn't necessarily farming speak, I always ask that question, well, what specifically do you mean by that? I've heard people, just for example, whether it's the glyphosate issue or whether it's using a chemical desiccant, agronomically speaking, I'm not an agronomist, but agronomically speaking, Kansas wheat does not usually require that agronomic practice of chemical desiccation prior to harvest. And so just walking people through, the crops we produce are healthy for us and they're good for us. And there's always room for improvement. But having that communication being able to flow both ways, I think, is key. And it's not easily achieved either.
Yeah, thank you. As an additional point from our survey to farmers last year, some of our project that we did was based on soil health bills that were introduced in the Kansas State Legislature. The first one, I think back in 2020, was about creating a carbon market payment system in Kansas. Never got a hearing in the committee or a vote, and then that was revamped to be a lot more about establishing a fund to incentivize soil health practices in 2021, as well as changing some of the language and statute about for different advisory committees or boards that people who get onto these advisory bodies need to have more knowledge about soil health practices and about conservation, having that as like a mandate in the kind of existing structure to help push that conversation along. And that bill also didn't get a hearing, but we asked farmers about that just to see what they thought about different legislative initiatives or how to work with the government. And a lot of them said that there are way too many requirements, regulations they have to go through to apply for things or to comply with programs that they do, or that they don't get enough information about them, or the information is, confusing, too technical. Takes a lot of energy to parse through a lot of this technical language, and it just was really bothersome to apply. I'm curious from your perspectives, if this is okay for you to talk about, do you think that state legislation in particular could be helpful to farmers or to you as an organization in your outreach to promote soil health? Or is that an area that maybe the state government doesn't need to be involved in, and private organizations like several of those here are better suited for? So curious on your thoughts, Steve.
Yeah, I think the most useful role for our state would be to infuse more money into the programming that is available to producers to help them make this transition. I just soon they keep their business to themselves about defining soil health and or who should be eligible or any of the pseudo or actual regulatory requirements. But we have a structure in place in Kansas through our State Conservation Commission and also at the federal level through NRCS, but also our conservation, each county conservation district to distribute funding and to define how that funding should be used in the way of practices. Just put about $50 million in that fund and watch the transition occur across the state of Kansas. And I think that's really all we need. So for our state senators and representatives who are listening, put that money in there and let's see how soil health lights a fire that carries across Kansas.
Yeah, I do know that several registered, so they might be here. I'm not sure. Katie.
I can only speak from my experience working with some of those state cost share programs. They're so valuable. And when I was working in that role, it was a big learning experience to see how well federal and state cost share actually work together, because there's not a one size fits all for every producer across the state. So I would imagine that that's the same for private funded, nonprofit funded incentives as well. I would say that you couldn't necessarily put all your eggs in one basket and say, hey, here's money, sign up this exact way, let's make sure everybody does it. Because it's not going to work for everybody for logistic reasons, but also for psychological reasons, like trust in who they go to sign up for incentives or other programs. So my only thought is diversify the options in how to sign up for an incentive or sign up for cost share or sign up for some sort of stimulant to get either more practices on the ground or more producers to consider starting doing soil health practices. That's it.
Thank you, Katie. Jessica.
Absolutely. We need to fund the programs. And that's funny. You know, I probably called Steve 3 or 4 times over the last couple of years and just asked. He's got really great experience on this, and just getting some guidance from him on how things need to be put together. I would definitely suggest that some of these bills that come forth have a robust farmer and rancher input into them. And I think that that would help out a lot too. And I know that there's going to be some more of this type of outreach that's going to be happening soon here in Kansas and in other states that GPR hopes to serve. But I do think that as a observation, not necessarily a position or an opinion at this point, I do observe that maybe the younger generation of farmers are keen on learning more about potential government programs, whether it be carbon credits or something else that has some sort of incentive. And I would just wonder if, as we start to transition from one generation to the next, if those viewpoints, you know, whether they stay the same or if they are softened up a little bit more to some of these ideas that we just talked about. Like I said, that was just an observation that my board was having recently about what we're seeing as far as who is really hopping on some of these new funding mechanisms that are being proposed through carbon credits.
Should go back and do some analysis on our survey results to kind of do the breakdown of ages and generations. I do know that I recall that some of the oldest people who responded were definitely some of the more vocal anti-government program people, and that could be to those individuals or it could be a generational thing, who knows. But yeah, there certainly could be some openness there for the younger generation. Jennifer.
I'll agree kind of a lot with what Steve said. You know, provide the funding to those who are already doing it and in place, and help them to get their education piece and spread their message more. You know, provide that funding there. I guess this must be telling of my age. I'm not a millennial. My thought is, you know, once you invite the government in, it's kind of hard to get them to leave. So put them in and give it to the hands of those that are doing the work. Allow them to continue to do theirs, but on a larger scale, you know, to have more of the field scale, you know, abilities to do these research studies where, you know, you don't have to fight so hard to find the funding to do them. If it was there and we could have those tools in place from the groups that have already started and then could spread the information they learn, I think that'd make quite the difference on things.
Awesome, thank you. We have about 13 minutes left, and I have one final question, and we have some time for questions as well, I think. But just in general, first of all, thank you all so much for coming here. Are there, I know my questions are not all encompassing, certainly. This is a large conversation, and 1 hour and 50 minutes isn't going to do it. But are there other thoughts that you have or other things that you feel are important to share about your work, farming in Kansas? I guess open up for what you feel is important to mention yet in this context. Steve?
Yeah, it's pretty broad, Ryan, but
All right.
the thing that I guess I would like for Kansas agriculture in particular, and I work across this region, but because I'm a Kansan, I'm a homer about that, but it is to see the enterprise level approach to agriculture come back to whole farm. And I think if we can get producers to understand that the livestock, the crops, maybe even small vegetable production, pollinators producing beneficial results on your farm, honeybees can bring in an income. If folks would kind of take a look at it in a more holistic fashion, and that this works because this works, or this isn't working because this isn't working, I think we'll see the minds of Kansas agriculture producers begin to really fully understand how important it is that they look at an agricultural landscape differently. It's no longer a petri dish, it's a system. And the system is what's supporting their families, their income, their livelihoods. And it's not to say it doesn't work the other way, because clearly we've taken 50 years to prove that it can work, separating enterprises. But even at a large scale, bringing all of the components of our production systems and the support for those production systems will really take off as we bring them back together, and the fence is no longer there to keep the cow out.
Thanks, Steve. Katie, any final thoughts?
Just a brief final thought. I want to stress something that I think Jennifer said a couple times about social norms and just the importance. I think a lot of times when we're doing outreach about a topic, we want to convince the people who are on the opposite end, the people who are only going to start soil health practices if it's working for everybody else. But in terms of social norms and trends in adopting new behaviors or different behaviors, it's really important to do outreach to the people who are already interested but haven't started first. So it's about that peer pressure. It's about the getting over those issues of peer pressure and social norms by reaching out first to the people who are curious.
Jessica? Thanks, Katie.
Systems approach. I agree. Looking at this as a whole systems approach to farming and being able to add all of the elements back into the system. And I think for Great Plains Regeneration, when we looked at what it was that was needed out there, we knew that we did not want to replicate the work of other groups, or we didn't want to add any sort of competition to that. So we were really interested in how do we close the loop for this outreach that we're trying to do. And I think that's where our focus on new market development and creating products is going to be key, and that some of this work that we are able to accomplish then supports and and is able to enhance others working in this space as well. For example, we have a project that we're working on right now. I can't go into too many details about it, but the goal is to be able to create a specific fund and a specific funding mechanism to come alongside our projects and give grants back for soil health that can go to organizations, that can go to producers. We're highly interested in how do we go about looking at the farming operation through the lens of a soil health plan. How do you do that with producers and landowners? How do you have that just circular communication that is sometimes so difficult to do? So I think in closing, looking at this as a systems approach, and nature nature works together. And when we all work together, I think we're going to see that everybody flourish. So thank you.
Thanks. Jennifer?
I'll just go back to that education component. You know, if we want to see change, that education just has got to be there. But it's not just it's education to everyone who's part of the whole food system. But even within on the farm, I talked and I'll continue to kind of beat this drum. You know, I'm here right now speaking with you today because a handful of years ago, I started attending meetings and workshops and conferences with my husband when I came to the realization that, you know, it takes a whole team to make the decisions on a farm. And at some point, I might have a larger role in that as his parents, you know, transition out or, you know, it's just going to come to be that some of it's for me. And I wanted to be an intelligent sounding board and partner for him. So, you know, I encourage, you know, educate spouses, educate, you know, children. Why are you out there? I mean, we all see the pictures, you know, you take your kids along, you know, they can learn more than you. They're capable of learning so much and asking the questions that, you know, you might overlook. They're wonderful resources, but your landlords, bankers, I mean, it's a whole team to do an operation, get them all on board, get them all to agree with that risk, that, you know, give that positive peer pressure to make some of these changes in there. And that, you know, could make a difference. And, you know, it's no one goes into farming on any scale to make a quick buck. Everyone's trying to do the right thing. And I think that we're now getting to a point, we've always known the soil was important. I mean, that was the beginning of, you know, terraces were the technology that existed a little while ago. We're just coming up with so much more and getting that word out and spreading it and realizing how valuable that soil is now is huge. And if we can continue to capitalize that and get more adoption to care for the soil, that'd be wonderful.
Wonderful, thank you. I will just say, moving forward from a KRC perspective, we hope to have another soil health policy grant this year for the next legislative session. And if we get funded for that, I'm hoping to work to connect with farmers and workshop whatever prospective bill there is and try and make that a lot more directly farmer informed in the end than it has been. So really appreciate several of you bringing up the importance of that and how that needs to be at the center of a lot of these things. So do we have any questions from folks in the audience in the last couple of minutes here? I see a question, but Steve already answered it in the chat. Thank you, Steve. But I can read that. Mike asked that other farmers around them have similar issues and are not willing to do small test plots to prove successful strategies or materials. How do we suggest encouraging small scale adoption to prove efficacy prior to large scale adoption? And Steve responded that plots are the best way to prove it to yourself. Try to get started on a small plot on the worst ground, and if it works there, it'll work on other acres. And cost share programs are important. So thank you for that, Steve. Stephen mentioned it's a shame ARS lost so much ground. The test plots were their jam, and it's imperative to implementation. So we have, I mean, there's good resources out there, and also backward steps we've taken from time to time, especially with different federal programs at different times. So I'm going to attach the soil health bill HB, or maybe I can't. The one from Kansas from this last trip, just for anyone who's interested, is HB 2310. And I don't know yet if something will be introduced, if anybody's interested in that. But if you ever want to know more about that, you can subscribe to KRC Publications and we'll try to get information out.
I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen over the years is that the latest hot button word or phrase or whatever, for instance, mycorrhizal fungi. The issue for me is that I see this as a much larger process and involving a lot more things than just that fungus. And I wonder if there's a way or to educate people. And let me step in and say that we are a farm and we also produce a soil builder material. So we have a vested interest in that as well. But the point simply is that if you don't use the current catchphrase, it doesn't seem to make much difference to people. And trying to reach people and get them to try something, I don't really care as much, believe it or not, if they use our product, but to use something that or a process that will enhance the soil and enhance the ability of plants to utilize the microbes and minerals that are in the soil. It seems a vast undertaking, at least from our perspective.
Mike, I'll take a shot. I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question, but I'll take a shot here. I think it goes back to what Jennifer said. It's an educational process. Whether we call it mycorrhizal fungi or we call it the soil community, it's really, to me, about putting it in terms for that person or that audience that they can relate to the best. The breadth of knowledge that has been discovered over the last 5 years about how much the fungal and microbial community contribute to available nutrient is enormous. And we've just really scraped it at this point. And I think as the successes of those that are doing good soil health become more and more in the forefront, and those folks can say, well, the reason that I'm being successful and making money is because I have treated my underground livestock just as well as I have treated my above ground livestock. And finding that common space with the person or the people you're talking to at that moment. For me, when you say mycorrhizal fungi, I understand that. It doesn't faze me. But for someone else, if you say mycorrhizal fungi, that may lock up the gears immediately. So understanding what your audience is may be as big a part of this educational process as anything.
I guess I would say that my frustration is that there's a focus on, for instance, that mycorrhizal fungi, and they're, or what, at this point, maybe somebody else answer that, but I think there's about 2,000 microbial, aerobic microbial populations that are helpful in plant growth and plant health that have been identified. And the idea that we deal with 1 or 2 of those or 10 or 15 of those is sort of short-sighted. And, and again, I'm not trying to sell anything here. When we inoculate, we're inoculating with 1,800 different varieties and or encouraging what's already there. And that seems to make a difference. I just don't see people willing to focus on a system rather than some specific things that are hot buttons today. And that's the issue that I found to be very frustrating.
Thanks, Mike. Does anybody else want to respond, or we'll close it out here? All right. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you all for this. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate having you all here and partnering with us in this and attending. So thank you so much.